Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming, and I'd like to thank Cook for inviting me to give this talk. I did a very basic and simple study, I think, looking at two different kinds of incubators, one of which is the MINC, which we have here, and the common Forma 3110, which most IVF laboratories use. There are some very basic differences which aren't necessarily evident in this slide. One of which is that the MINC is considerably smaller than a Forma, and the system that it uses is very different in terms of the way it works. With the MINC, the gas is actually pre-mixed. It's a triple gas mix, and it comes into the back of the unit, which is back here, and goes through a 0.2 micron filter and then into a humidification flask. And then each one of the tubes that come out of the humidification flask go into the chamber. And when you open the MINC, it opens like that. So it's very different than using a Forma, and it was something that we had to get used to in our laboratory. What I did was I took sibling oocytes from IVF cycles, and I split them, basically. We used duplicate sets of media, duplicate sets of dishes that were gassed overnight in either the MINC or the Forma, and the oocytes were randomly separated after the egg retrieval into one or the other incubators. The eggs were retrieved in modified HTF with a Cook 17-gauge needle with a rocket pump. They were washed twice in modified HTF. We cut cumulus on all of our oocytes after we retrieved them, and then they were randomly allocated to either the MINC or the Forma. In terms of the culture system, everything is cultured in 50 microliter drops under oil. I use sage fertilization media. Thank you, Patrick. Supplemented with 10% HSA. Post-fertilization, again, sage CM, supplemented with 10% HSA. And for day 3 embryo transfers, the media is supplemented with 75% SSS. The afternoon of day 3, any non-transferred embryos are moved to Metacalled blastocyst media, and then either embryos are frozen on day 5 or a media change until day 6. In the instances where we did blastocyst transfer, we did it in Metacalled media supplemented with 65% SSS. The average pHs of our media in both systems for the FM, it was around 7.38. There was a range from 7.25 to 7.45. In CM, 7.36. The range was 7.2 to 7.47. And the blast media, the average was 7.4 with a range of 7.2 to 7.49. These are all measured with an Orion microgel electrode. The sperm prep was a very basic sperm prep with a dual stage isolate. The pellet was washed twice in modified HTF, supplemented with 5% HSA, and concentrated to half a ml volume. Insemination was done 4 to 6 hours post-retrieval, whether it was ICSI or standard IVF. We inseminate with 0.5 million motile sperm per mil, and there's usually 2 to 3 eggs per drop. For ICSI, the eggs are denuded with hyaluronidase, rinsed in HTF, injected, washed several times, and then put into either system. Fertilization determination 16 to 20 hours after insemination. 2 PNs are washed 4 times in fresh media from each culture system and continue to culture until transfer. On transfer day, the majority of 90 of the cycles we transferred on day 3, 12 we did blastocyst transfer. All of the embryos are chosen by embryo quality, not which embryo they were incubated into. And there were a total of 102 transfers. Now the systems are a little different. The Forma, we ran 6% CO2 and the balance was room air. We have internal coda filters in them, and everything runs through the water pan. and they're obviously kept at 37. The MINC has a mix, a triple gas mix that is piped directly into the MINC. 6% CO2, 5% oxygen, balance is nitrogen. And they have a purge system whereby when you open the MINC and you close it, it purges the system for 3 minutes. The CO2, all the measurements were done with an infrared Labitech InControl 1050. Now, the cost of operation is something that we were concerned about, and I looked at the price of triple gas, and when you buy pre-mixed gas, it's much more expensive. It's about $133 a cylinder. That might be a little inflated because it's New York, or that could be a real price, I'm not sure. Whereas CO2 is about $35 a cylinder. And as I think was mentioned before, the MINCs use very little gas, and that can obviously be attributed to the fact that their chambers are very small. They do have a constant flow of gas, which you can adjust on the front of the MINC from a low flow to a higher flow. I use the lowest setting because when you open the chamber, it purges anyway, and I didn't see any reason to have more gas flowing through when it wasn't open. So what ended up happening was the total annual cost was very similar to running the pricier triple gas versus the CO2 incubators. And here are my fertilization results. There were a total of 1,189 oocytes inseminated, 621 in the MINC. Fertilization rate was 72% overall. In the Formas, 568 were inseminated with a fertilization rate of 67%, and there is a significant difference there. I broke that out into whether they were standard inseminations or ICSI inseminations. The fertilization rate in the MINC for standard inseminations was 70%, and in the Formas was 65%. Again, these are sibling oocytes. With ICSI, the MINC fertilization rates were 74%, and the Formas 68%. Here's the overall fertilization rates in the MINC versus the Forma, and then here are the breakdowns of the various categories in both the MINCs and the Formas. Now, what happened once we put embryos back? Well, since we were incubating eggs and embryos in different systems, I had to break out the pregnancy rates into different categories depending on where the embryos came from. And basically there were 3 types of embryo transfers. There were transfers where all of the embryos were cultured in the MINC and transferred. There were cases where all the embryos came from the Forma. And then there were mixes where, again, we chose the best embryos, and not based on where they were incubated, but what were the best embryos to transfer. The pregnancy rate for the MINC solely incubated were 64% per embryo transfer. The Forma was 54%, and then when we had a mix of embryos from both chambers or both types of incubators, it was 51%, 57% per transfer overall, and those are all clinical pregnancies with the gestational sac. So here's the MINC, here's the Forma, and then here's the mix. Now, the mix was a little more difficult because I needed to look at, well, what kind of mix was it? Was it a mix where the majority of the embryos came from the MINC? Was it a mix where the majority of the embryos came from the Forma? Or was it an equal mix of embryos? And I looked at those, and you can see the ends are not very large. But when you looked at the majority of embryos coming from the MINC, the pregnancy rates were 48%, the Forma 33%, and the equal number was very high. It was a 75%, but the N was quite small. And I also went back and looked at the implantation rates per embryo. It was 40% per embryo with the MINC, 35% with the Forma, and 21% when I did a mix. When I looked at the implantation rates of the mixed embryos, it was 16% per embryo when the majority of the embryos came from the MINC system, 11% from the Forma, and when they were equal, it was a 50% rate. I also looked at the average number of embryos that we transferred, 2.2 in the MINC, 2.2 in the Forma, and a higher 3.4 when we put back embryos from both systems. When I broke down the mixed system, the average number of embryos was 3.7, 2.4, and 2.0. The average age of our patients was 33.3. For the patients that had only MINC-derived embryos, the average age was a little over 32. For the Forma embryos, it was a little younger, 30.8, and the mix was our older patients, 35.1. So in this particular study where I looked at the same media with sibling oocytes, what I got was higher fertilization rates in the MINC, higher implantation rates, and higher pregnancy rates. And I would assume that that's because the chamber is smaller, there's a faster recovery, the gas concentration and humidity recover faster, and there's less stress on the eggs and embryos. Thank you very much.